Something strange is happening in global politics, and this time it's not China or Russia shaking Washington's nerves, it's India, and not just India's rise. But where it's rising, Africa. For years, the United States saw Africa as a backyard for Western aid, resources, and military influence. But while Washington was distracted by its battles in Europe and Asia, India quietly entered the scene not with soldiers or sanctions, but with business, technology, and trust. Now, the quiet partnership between India and Africa has become Washington's newest nightmare. You see, the US built its power on control over finance, over trade, and over who gets access to development. But India is doing something America never expected, building partnerships without domination, and that's changing everything. Across the continent, from Nairobi to Abuja, from Addis Ababa to Johannesburg, Indian engineers, doctors, and investors are creating a new ecosystem, one that doesn't run through Washington or Brussels. Instead, it runs through New Delhi, and the numbers don't lie. India's trade with Africa has now crossed $100 billion, quietly surpassing several European nations. Indian companies are building solar grids in Kenya, digital payment systems in Nigeria, and industrial corridors in Ethiopia. And they're doing it without lectures, without conditions, and without debt traps. This is what makes Washington nervous. Because for decades, the West controlled Africa's destiny by controlling its loans, its technology, and even its leaders. Now, India is showing Africa a different path, one where collaboration replaces dependency. And that terrifies the people in Washington who've grown used to Africa staying in its place. Let's be clear, India isn't acting out of charity, it's acting out of strategy. It knows the future of global power depends on who Africa stands with, and by positioning itself as Africa's partner, not its master, India is securing a role that America can no longer claim, the trusted friend. Think about it. When America talks about Africa, it talks about aid. When India talks about Africa, it talks about innovation. When America sends troops, India sends technology. And that simple difference is reshaping the continent's alliances faster than Washington can react. In Ghana, Indian firms are building pharmaceutical plants that reduce dependence on imported medicine. In Tanzania, India is investing in renewable energy projects that could power millions of homes. And in Rwanda, India's digital infrastructure programs are connecting rural schools to the internet without waiting for Western approval. It's no longer the 1960s Cold War game of influence. This is a new war, a digital, economic, and ideological one. And in this war, India's greatest weapon isn't the military. It's mutual respect. For Washington, that's a dangerous precedent. Because if India can succeed in Africa using cooperation instead of coercion, then America's old model of dominance begins to crumble. Behind closed doors, policymakers in Washington are asking the same question: how did we miss this? How did India, once a developing country dependent on aid itself, become a global bridge between Asia and Africa? The answer lies in timing and trust. While the US was sanctioning rivals, India was signing trade deals. While the West was lecturing African nations about democracy, India was helping them build digital democracies, online voting systems, data centers, and AI hubs. And while Western investors were pulling money out of the continent, India was quietly putting billions in. That is the part America never saw coming: the rise of a nation that plays both sides of the global order. India can shake hands with Washington one day and ink deals with African, BRICS, and Global South nations the next. It doesn't pick sides, it creates them. And that flexibility is exactly what Africa has been waiting for: a partner that listens before it leads. But make no mistake, this isn't just economics. It's about influence. Who controls Africa's internet cables, energy grids, ports, and data will control the future of global trade. And right now, India is outpacing everyone else. In just the last 5 years, Indian companies have expanded into over 30 African countries. They're building fintech networks that bypass the US dollar. They're setting up local manufacturing hubs that threaten Western monopolies, and they're even launching security and defense collaborations that could reduce Africa's reliance on Western weapons. That's why Washington is afraid, not because India is invading Africa, but because it's inspiring it. It's teaching African nations to look east instead of west, to trade with equals instead of creditors, to believe that sovereignty isn't a privilege, it's a right. Every road India builds, every satellite it helps launch, every digital platform it codes is a message. Africa doesn't need saving, it needs partners. And while American news outlets remain focused on China's Belt and Road, they've missed the quiet revolution led by India, a revolution built not on loans but on leverage, not on control but on connection. So yes, Washington is worried, because this time the challenge isn't coming from an adversary, it's coming from a democracy, a former colony that's now empowering the very continent. Western powers once divided, And that's the part of the story they can't explain away, because if India succeeds in Africa, it proves something the West has denied for decades, that nations can rise together without a master. This is the shift the world didn't expect, the rise of a South-South alliance that doesn't need approval from Washington, London, or Paris. A new network of trade, technology, and trust that could define the next century. So the question isn't whether America can stop India's rise in Africa. The question is what happens when it can't.
No one in Washington saw this coming. For decades, the United States believed Africa's loyalty was unshakable, that aid, dollars, and defense deals would keep the continent in its orbit. But something unexpected has begun to unfold. Something that's quietly terrifying America's policymakers. Because while the US was busy policing the world, India was building one. Over the past 5 years, India has moved into Africa not with soldiers or sanctions, but with technology, medicine, and trade. In 2024 alone, Indian investment in Africa surged past $50 billion, covering everything from solar grids in Kenya to defense cooperation in Tanzania. To the average viewer, it looks like progress, but to Washington, it looks like a threat. You see, for over half a century, the US viewed Africa as its strategic backyard, a playground of influence through US aid, IMF loans, and military bases. But today, the script has flipped. The very nations once dependent on Western aid are now turning east to New Delhi, Beijing, and even Moscow, searching for alternatives that don't come with lectures or strings attached. And in this quiet shift, India has become the most underestimated player in the global south. When India launched the Pan-Africa E-Network project, connecting remote African hospitals and universities with Indian expertise, US diplomats laughed. When India opened lines of credit to build railways and roads, the State Department called it symbolic diplomacy. But now, those symbolic projects are turning into strategic leverage. African nations are signing defense pacts, technology exchanges, and energy partnerships, all under India's quietly expanding umbrella. So why is Washington suddenly afraid? Because India isn't playing the same game. It's not replacing America's power, it's outsmarting it. While the US preaches democracy and human rights, India speaks the language Africa understands best: mutual growth and respect. Where Washington offers aid, India offers partnership, and that difference is rewriting Africa's future. Let's take one example: Ethiopia. When the US cut aid during the Tigray conflict, India stepped in, quietly funding agricultural, tech, and pharmaceutical supply chains. While American policymakers debated sanctions, Indian companies built infrastructure. That subtle contrast didn't go unnoticed in African capitals. Today, Ethiopia, once a symbol of US aid dependency, is welcoming Indian firms into its industrial parks, telecommunications, and education systems. And Ethiopia isn't alone. From Nigeria to Kenya, from South Africa to Ghana, India's footprint is expanding at lightning speed in oil, defense, fintech, and renewable energy. Over 8,000 Indian companies now operate across Africa, and their combined trade is expected to surpass $150 billion by 2030. But that's not what scares Washington. What truly rattles the US is how India is aligning Africa's vision with BRICS, not NATO. Because for the first time in modern history, Africa is no longer looking west for permission. It's building a future on its own terms, and India has become its preferred partner. In Washington's foreign policy circles, this shift is being described as the silent earthquake, because it doesn't come with the flash of war or the noise of sanctions. It comes through diplomacy, data cables, and solar panels. Behind closed doors, the US is scrambling. Reports from think tanks like CSIS and Brookings have begun warning that India's rise in Africa could reshape global influence away from the West. Some American strategists even call it the second non-aligned revolution. Why? Because India's playbook looks hauntingly familiar. It is the same strategy America once used after World War II. Invest, connect, and dominate through influence rather than invasion. But here's the catch: India's influence feels different. It doesn't come with troops or threats. It comes with empathy. It reminds African nations of a shared history, a story of colonization, resistance, and rebirth. And that emotional connection is something the West can't buy with Ador arms. So when Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi calls African leaders brothers in destiny, it's not just diplomacy. It's strategy, a rebranding of power through partnership. And this is where Washington's fear begins. Because if Africa, with its minerals, its youth population, its energy reserves, tilts toward India, it doesn't just shift influence. It shifts the balance of global power. The US risks losing access to billions in resources, defense cooperation, and diplomatic leverage to a country it once underestimated as just the world's back office. For years, India was seen as America's ally, a counterweight to China. But in Africa, the lines are blurring, because in the global south, India isn't acting like a Western proxy, it's acting like a leader. And that's the part Washington didn't see coming. This is not just about trade or diplomacy. It's about a global realignment where India and Africa are rewriting the world's balance of power. And America is watching nervously from the sidelines. While Washington still sees Africa as a land of development projects, India sees it as the engine of the next global economy. And that's not just talk. It's a billion-dollar strategy quietly unfolding, one trade deal, one data cable, one refinery at a time. Let's start with the money. In 2023, India signed a series of currency swap and trade settlement agreements with African nations, allowing them to bypass the US dollar entirely. What sounds like a technical deal is actually a geopolitical earthquake, because for decades, the US dollar wasn't just a currency, it was controlled. Every loan, every oil shipment, every development fund was routed through the dollar, giving Washington invisible power over Africa's economic heartbeat. But now, that grip is slipping. India began paying for African oil in rupees. Then came trade settlements in local currencies, cutting the dollar from the loop. And when Kenya's central bank hinted it might follow suit, US Treasury officials called it a dangerous trend. Dangerous. Because if Africa trades with India in rupees or local currencies, the demand for dollars drops, and with it, America's influence. This isn't charity, it's economic re-engineering. India's Exim Bank now funds over $12 billion in African infrastructure loans, but unlike the IMF, these come with no political lectures, no democracy conditions, no Washington consensus. That's what African leaders call respectful aid, and that's what terrifies Washington most. Because America built its soft power on moral superiority, but India's rise in Africa is proving that pragmatism wins over preaching. But money is only one front. India's second move is human capital. Through programs like the India-Africa Forum Summit, thousands of African students receive scholarships to study in Delhi, Bangalore, and Hyderabad. They return home not as clients of the West, but as partners of India. In the 1980s, the US trained Africa's elites through US aid. In the 2020s, India is doing the same, but with a digital twist. India is laying digital cables across East Africa, connecting Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Addis Ababa directly to Mumbai's tech backbone. To Washington, this might seem harmless, but data is the new oil, and whoever controls Africa's digital gateways controls its future. The US knows this, and it's panicking, because Silicon Valley is losing ground to Bangalore. There's another layer: defense. In 2024, India signed defense training agreements with Kenya and Mozambique, offering military technology and joint naval patrols in the Indian Ocean. That may sound small until you realize the Indian Ocean is America's forgotten frontier. It connects East Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, a trillion-dollar corridor Washington used to dominate. Now, India's expanding its naval footprint, and for the first time, US defense analysts are admitting the Indo-African arc could challenge American sea power in the next decade. This isn't an accident. It is part of India's long game, a geopolitical triangle stretching from Mumbai to Mombasa to Maputo, ports, pipelines, and partnerships that quietly bypass Western oversight. And behind that triangle, a silent partner, the BRICS alliance. Within BRICS, India and South Africa have become the twin engines of a new South-South economic order. They're pushing trade in local currencies, new digital payment systems, and even talks of an alternative to SWIFT, the same system that Washington uses to sanction countries at will. To the average viewer, it looks like progress. To Washington, it looks like defiance, and perhaps the biggest irony. The US helped build this moment by alienating the very partners it now needs. When Washington imposed sanctions on African countries for trading with Russia or China, many turned to India as a neutral bridge. Now India is becoming the mediator, the connector, a role America once proudly owned. In the eyes of African leaders, India's rise isn't a threat, it's a second chance. A partner that shares their colonial scars but offers something the West rarely does: dignity. And that right there is why Washington is nervous. Because fear isn't always born from aggression. Sometimes it comes from realizing you're no longer needed. India's moves in Africa aren't loud. They don't come with wars or warnings, but make no mistake, they're changing everything. Trade routes, currencies, alliances, all quietly drifting away from the dollar's shadow. And somewhere in a DC think tank, An analyst is typing the same 3 words on a classified report. We didn't see it coming. Behind closed doors in Washington, the mood has changed. What was once dismissed as a diplomatic experiment is now classified as a strategic threat. In briefing rooms across the Pentagon and Foggy Bottom, the question isn't if India's rise in Africa is real, it's how to contain it, and the answers they're coming up with are starting to look eerily familiar. Because when the United States loses influence, it doesn't step back quietly. It reorganizes, rebrands, and re-enters the game, this time through soft power warfare. Sources close to diplomatic think tanks have started whispering about a new initiative inside the U.S. State Department, one designed to reassert American values. In Africa, it sounds noble on paper. But behind the language of values lies an unmistakable goal: to push India out of Africa's economic bloodstream, Washington's first weapon. Narrative control. Western media outlets are suddenly flooded with stories about debt risks, opaque contracts, and corruption concerns tied to African trade with India. It's a familiar pattern. The same rhetoric once used to discredit China's Belt and Road. Only this time, the target wears a different flag: the second weapon, economic leverage. New proposals are surfacing in the U.S. Congress to expand the Prosper Africa Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar fund meant to counter non-Western influence. But in reality, it's an attempt to pull Africa back into the dollar system. By any means necessary, Washington is now offering trade guarantees, private sector incentives, even military training packages, all dressed up as partnership, but engineered as containment. The irony. These are the very tools America once criticized China for using. Now they're being dusted off and repackaged against India. But here's where it starts to backfire. Africa in 2025 isn't the Africa of the 1990s. This is a continent that negotiates, resists, and remembers. And many of its leaders now see Washington's sudden attention not as help, but as fear. When America pressures them to pick sides, they look east, to India, and find an alternative that doesn't come with ultimatums. Meanwhile, India keeps expanding its partnerships not through speeches but results. In Ghana, Indian tech firms are powering e-governance. In Tanzania, Indian solar companies are lighting up villages off the grid. And in Nigeria, Indian refineries are reducing the cost of fuel imports. These are visible results, not promises. Not loans, tangible progress. And no amount of PR spin from Washington can erase what Africans see on the ground. But the real turning point came when India proposed a Global South investment for a BRICS-aligned initiative inviting African nations to trade directly with Asia and Latin America, skipping Western institutions altogether. That proposal sent shockwaves through Washington's policy circles. One analyst from the Atlantic Council even warned, if Africa and India succeed in building parallel financial systems, the dollar's global dominance will erode within a decade. And that's when the counter-operations began. Washington started ramping up intelligence cooperation with select African states, not to fight terrorism this time, but to track Indian economic movements. Aid programs were quietly redirected toward regions where India's footprint was strongest: Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria. The goal: rebrand U.S. influence, rebuy loyalty, and stall India's momentum. But here's the flaw. Every time America tries to contain a global South power, it ends up pushing more countries toward them. The same happened with Russia. The same happened with China. And now history is repeating with India. You can't fight partnership with pressure, and you can't buy trust once it's been lost. In Nairobi, diplomats are now openly saying it. Washington talks, India listens. And that's the quiet truth shaping Africa's 21st century. So as Washington tightens its grip, India just keeps shaking more hands. African leaders aren't choosing sides. They're choosing results, and the more America tries to box India in, the clearer it becomes that this isn't a contest of power, it's a contest of perception. Washington's fear isn't that India will dominate Africa. Its fear is that Africa no longer needs to be dominated. And that realization, that quiet, uncomfortable truth, is what keeps policymakers awake at night. Because the more they look east, the more they realize that the 21st century isn't being built in Washington anymore. It's being built between Mumbai and Nairobi. The age of Western guardianship is ending, and the next superpower alliance has already begun.